Welcome back to our Espresso at Home series. I'm Kathryn, and in this video we will cover how extraction affects flavors and begin to cover dialing in. That is improving your shot by tweaking the different pieces of pulling a shot. In the last lesson, we talked a lot about the different ways that channeling happens. So what is channeling and why is it bad? Channeling is a place in the espresso puck that water starts moving through more than in its surrounding area. It's a little tunnel with lower resistance, or possibly even a tiny air gap, like around the edge of the puck if you disturb it after tamping, that allows water to rush through there faster. So more of the water in your shot moves through this area and less through the rest of the bed. On this machine, I actually have what's called a naked portafilter or a bottomless portafilter, and that allows you to see a little more clearly if channeling happens since there aren't spouts, so you might see that later. What that causes is a localized area of over-extraction. You move too much water through these grounds, and it pulls everything good out of the grounds, and then it keeps pulling on them. How the flavor changes over time is always following the same profile, and it's because of what are called solubles in your coffee bean, alongside fats and oils which don't really dissolve, but they still move into your shot glass out of your portafilter, so I'll lump them in there. All these things dissolve into water, and they leave the grounds, and they run into your cup. The first things that are extracted are the acids, some salts, and usually the caffeine. Acids are very soluble in hot water, so they dissolve fast and they end up in your shot first. Now, these acids are primarily from the coffee fruit. These are what give fruitiness to a coffee, and they aren't a bad thing on their own, but they are really quite overwhelming if all you get is that fruity acid. Think about lemons versus lemonade. One of them is delightful, even though it still has all of the acid from that lemon. But if you don't ever get to the part where you add sugar and you just suck on a mouthful of lemon, it is a very different experience. You might like lemons, and that's great, but I do hope you understand that most people probably prefer lemonade to plain lemons. When you only extract these first flavored acids, that is called under-extracted. The next thing that starts to dissolve are the sugars. This is really the sweet spot. We want to get as much of the sugar out of the bean as we can because this makes that fruity acidity much more enjoyable and creates a smoother, less face puckering experience with espresso. You also get a lot of the fats and the oils emulsifying into the espresso. That is the crema. You get a little more body and a little more of a savory profile from this. If you can get all of these sugars and not start getting into the next bitter flavors, you have a very well-balanced extraction. And at the end, you start getting bitter flavors, generally plant fibers. When you start extracting these, you get a very bitter, very mouth-drying espresso. And because these are much slower to dissolve, they're harder to dissolve, they take more water, so you're getting more water in your shot, and it's getting weaker. So it might be really, really watery and weak and bitter and still mouth-drying, even though it's very watery. This is what is over-extracted. Channeling causes extraction to reach this point very quickly in a localized part of your puck. And importantly, because so much water can flow through these channels, you can have the rest of your puck remain under-extracted because not enough water was able to move through the rest of the puck to extract the sugars from the rest of it. So bitter flavors are a little trickier to manage when you're dialing in because you might have a shot with bitterness, but it is because of channels and not because your whole shot went too long. This is part of why we had a whole lesson on evenness. Reducing channeling helps make your espresso taste better, and it makes it much easier to dial in because you won't have as much competition between the bitter and the sour flavors without ever even reaching the sugars from most of the grounds. This order is true of all coffees, no matter how much more or less soluble a given bean may be. The solubles still follow that same profile, just more quickly or more slowly. Caffeine, acids, sugars, savory flavors, bitter plant matter. I'm going to do a little demo now. You've probably seen this demo if you've Googled how the taste of espresso changes or if you've dug into extraction a lot. It's a good example, that's why you see it, and that's also why I'm gonna do it now. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to pull a shot, but I'm gonna divide it into several portions. And for this, I'm actually going to pull it even a little longer than I would ever normally pull a shot because I wanna make sure that the end part is definitely really over-extracted because I think it's a good way to understand entirely over-extracted versus bitterness from over-extracted channels. So I have my 4 shot glasses here, and you can watch this process, or if you have a machine, go ahead and do it with me at home. Go ahead and taste them, and I'll also taste them and talk through them. Try to taste each of these distinguishing features. I'm actually going to be weighing out each piece of the shot because I have a little scale here. And I'm going to use a target of 45 grams, even if that's not a perfectly dialed in shot, it will work for this demo. So, I talked about dose. For this dose, the basket I have is an 18-gram basket, so I'm going to be using that as my dose. Give this a wipe because I want it to be dry. And I'm kind of distributing as I pour, like I talked about in the evenness video. All right, so now I have these parts here, and you can even see just a difference over the course of the shot. This one's very dark, very viscous. The creme is a lot darker. This one looks a little bit more like your small shot that you might see normally. This one's getting a little thin, and this one is very clear, very watery. So if I were to taste each of these, I'm gonna just pour a little bit into my shot glass here. That is very sour. It's very strong. It almost even tastes a little bit salty. And that tastes a little more like what I might expect from espresso. It's a little more flat. It doesn't have a lot of acids because all of those ended up here. And that's getting very watery. It's not quite bitter yet, but it's very watery. And this one's not gonna be any good. Yep, nope, I'm not sipping any more of that. But you can taste each of the changing flavor profiles, and now if you mix them back together, you should have what's close to a decent shot. And once you've mixed them, try to taste each of a little bit of what you tasted from each portion. A little more of the sweetness, a little more of the brightness, but once they're mixed together, it should hopefully be a little more pleasant. Not a perfect shot, but that's why we're dialing in. So, I need to clean these, and then we'll get started tasting some more shots and dialing in. I'm back, so let's get started tasting some espresso and dialing in. There isn't a set of steps for every espresso because by now I hope you realize there are so many factors and I cannot prescribe one way to dial in. But I have some tips based on what you're experiencing. So first, you need that recipe, your dose and your yields. As I said, I am using an 18-gram basket, so that's just the dose that I'm going to use. That is kind of the best way to pick your dose based on the size of your basket. You can always make a smaller shot than what the basket prescribes. It'll just be a little messier, but it's fine. But you don't want to go any bigger than what the basket says because otherwise you'll have grounds start pressing against your screen and it will just cause problems. Like I said, 18-gram basket, this is my dose. As for yields, I'm going to start with about a 1 to 2.5 ratio because that's a decent rule of thumb. That's where I got the 45 grams. Since I have an 18-gram dose, I'll be targeting that 45-gram yield. So I'm weighing out my dose on this scale here, just like I did a minute ago. And then as the shot's pulling, I'll be weighing that as well as timing so that I have a sense of what happened when I tweak things later. So I paused it just before I got to 45s to give it time to get up there. So I hit 44.5 grams here. And that went in about 49 seconds. So that's probably pretty long. I probably want to go a little coarser, just looking at that. And that's definitely, it's on the bitter side, which, as I mentioned, could be due to channeling, but given the length of time, given how fine that was, it's probably also a little over extracted. I do want you to really change how you think about bitterness. When you taste bitterness, unless you know it choked, unless you know it took a very long time, think about channeling first and try to adjust that, try to distribute better before you go coarser. But in this case, because it was just so long, I am gonna go a little coarser. So before I grind the next shot, this might be a point where you want to tweak your yield since I just started this. If it's way off, if it's too strong or too weak, I'd adjust it. Especially if it's very strong and very sour together, then I would increase yield. If it's very weak and very bitter together, I would decrease yields. But I'm gonna stick with the same one for now, and we're just going a little bit coarser. So I don't know if you could see it on the video, but there was actually a little bit of channeling, those little jets that shot out from underneath. That's a little bit of channeling. I also jumped way down on my time, so I'm guessing the channeling contributed to that a little bit. I'm still gonna taste it, but I'm probably gonna try the exact same thing and distribute it a little bit better. It's definitely a better flavor profile. I have a lot more brightness. There's a little bit of sweetness. It's still a little bitter, but again, I think that's, well, I know that it channeled, so I'm gonna assume that the flavor of that mostly came from the channeling there. Let me pause here real quick and talk about if your machine runs on time instead of running until you shut it off the way this one does. Many home machines operate on that time setting, whereas a shot will be programmed as 30 seconds or 20 seconds. And there are a couple of ways that you can still target yields given that programming. First, like I'm using here, if you have a scale that you can place under the group head like this one, you can set your programming to be something really long, something like a minute or 45 seconds or something that you know is really long, and then just pretend you're pulling a shot on a machine that doesn't have a timer. Start the shot, watch the weights, manually stop the shot when you are just under that target yields because it'll go for another second. This is typically how I dial in on like a big commercial machine that just goes until whenever I tell it to stop. If you don't have a small scale, if you have to stop the shot and then take the shot glass over to a bigger kitchen scale, you might have to do a little more guess and check. I don't have one of these fancy scales at my home, so I do this guess and check method. So remember our target times, 25-ish, 35-ish seconds. Pick one. You can pick it at random if you like. Say 25 seconds, pull your shot, weigh it, see what that yield is. And now, if your yield is too small, increase your time. If it's too big, decrease your time. This method does add a few more steps along the way because now you have to get to the right time to get the right yields before you can even really taste like what the shot is supposed to be like. And once you get to that yield you were targeting, now you might have to change a factor like grind and you'll have to adjust your time again. So it's a little bit longer of a process and you might have to throw out a few more shots each time you dial in a new coffee that you've bought, but it is still possible. Maybe you also have a really fancy home machine that does volumetric programming. And if so, you're still gonna wanna double check your shots every so often that they do weigh the correct amount, because volumetric pulling is actually based on how much water has pumped through the grounds. And for a variety of reasons, the amount of water that is retained in that espresso bed might be a little bit higher or lower, especially from coffee to coffee. So even if the machine always pumps 58 milliliters of water into this group head, one time the shot might weigh 45 grams, another time it might weigh 50, and those will taste different. So I got less channeling out that time, and that's actually a really good shot. I could keep tweaking this if I wanted to, but I've spent a couple of shots already. If I were making this at home and not going for the absolute god shot, I would be very happy with this. And that's only a couple of shots here. When you're starting, it'll probably be more, but as you practice, you'll get to the point where you can probably only cover a couple of shots. So let me quickly review extraction. Sour means under extracted. The best way to start extracting more is by making your grind size finer. Remember that this both increases surface area and decreases flow rate, so you are adding a lot of extra extraction ability with a very small change. Bitter does mean over extracted, but it is much more likely due to channeling than it is to the entire shot being over extracted. If it's bitter like that first shot was and also ran really long, then yes, go coarser. But if it wasn't an overly long pull and it's bitter, or if it's not really weak and watery and bitter, then it's a lot more likely due to channeling like that second shot. So for that bitterness, do you taste a little bit of sourness alongside? Is it bitter but not overly mouth drying, maybe even has a little bit of sweetness alongside the bitterness? This could indicate that while over extraction happened, the whole shot was probably not over extracted. So how do you fix this? Evenness. Try distributing your grounds a little better. Make sure you're tamping levelly. Try to focus on channeling first when you taste bitterness. You can still go a little coarser even if the concern is channeling, because it could be because of clumping or too many fines, but you should not be yo-yoing, getting finer, getting too bitter, going coarser, getting too sour. If that's what you're getting, it's probably evenness or time to adjust a different factor. So the other factors, increasing yields without changing dose will increase extraction, but remember the shot will not be as strong. So if you already have a strong shot, but you want more extraction and you don't mind if it gets a little weaker, or if the shot is too strong and too heavy bodied, then extracting a little more is great by adjusting the yields. And inversely, if you have a weak shot that's bitter, decreasing yields will make a stronger shot and be less extracted. Increasing dose, but targeting the same yield is roughly like decreasing yields, but if you don't actually want a smaller shot, but still want more extraction, you could increase your dose instead of decreasing your yield. Adding heat, if you can, will increase extraction. Adding heat, if you can, will increase extraction. This is generally only more helpful on really hard to extract coffees, which I'll cover in a later lesson on how or why to pick coffees for your espresso. So tuck that into the back of your mind for later. It's not something I change much. Our next video is going to get into how the coffee you use in espresso impacts your shots and offer some tips when you're looking for what you want to buy for your home espresso. You can find the link to that next video in the bio, and if you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe. You can also find other classes at sagebrushcoffee.com. Thanks again for watching. I'm Kathryn, and I hope you have a great day.